Greetings, everybody. It's the night of the 25th of October 2023, and it's a momentous day for reasons I will come to in just a moment. But before that, I will greet those of you who are in the chat already. So that's hello to Jay over there in Norfolk, Virginia, and hello to Philbin over there in Rhode Island, who says, "Greetings, comrades, and solidarity from Rhode Island." And you saying that you saw the Class Consciousness Project live stream last night. Well, that was very good stuff by my comrade Jason. If you've not watched it, I will drop a link in the chat room here, just so you can check this out, because I think Jason did a very good job last night going through his some of issues and personal story inside the trade union movement, and I would encourage everybody to watch that if they have not done so already. So, good evening to President Jesus and DE, Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, who says Free Palestine. Yes, you can get into trouble for saying that sort of thing. And good evening to Mohammed Mohsen. Good evening to you out there in Egypt. Good to have viewers in multiple locations around the world, as always. And coming to a discussion of the events in Palestine in just a moment. First of all, though, it's a momentous day for me in this channel, because we had our first official strike from YouTube, and they've removed the live stream video of the show that I did where I ran through what I called the fraud of the Oslo process, which is, of course, the fake peace process that was set up by the American imperialists in the 1990s, which involved the Palestinians giving up a gigantic amount of concessions in return for getting around about 22% of the land that should be theirs, and the Zionist state giving up absolutely nothing, and in fact continuing in settlement expansion. And this was part of the reason why I did that live stream, was to explain why Fatah and the PLO lost credibility and why Hamas gained credibility in the 1990s. And that video has been removed by YouTube for, quote, glorification of a violent terrorist organization. Now, of course, I don't need to tell you, but I will anyway, that if I did a video for an hour outlining the heroism of the Israeli Defense Force and why Israel is justified in everything that it does, why Israel should nuke various locations and everything else, I would probably be suffering no ill effects whatsoever from YouTube or government censorship. So, from tomorrow, what I'm going to be doing to ensure that we have multiple platforms available to us, I'm going to be starting to do this live stream to both Odyssey and Rumble as well, and any other platform I can find to live stream to. If you want the recording of that program, in which I talked about the Oslo process, you will have to go to Patreon now, because that's the only surviving record of it. YouTube has erased that video. I will be appealing, hilariously, YouTube tries to make you go through a training course as to how to police your content. It's like being back, being referred to human resources again. Needless to say, I will not be doing that. I will submit the appeal, and if YouTube fucks that off, then I'll just have to stream more on other platforms, or stream this live stream on Odyssey and Rumble as well. Maybe BitChute too. I need to investigate that. But there you go. Just goes to show that there is, of course, an active regime of censorship in place, as many so-called free speech warriors have been calling for, including certain people like Mr. Sam Harris. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. And good evening to Lee, Muzzlepaint, Gannibal, Will, and Michael. Gannibal says, solidarity and greetings. Free Palestine, free all political prisoners. Absolutely. Will says, Oslo seems to be a key word, getting people censored. Same thing happened to Thomas Farsi on Twitter when he did exactly the same thing. Explained Oslo. Ah, okay, that might explain it. Okay, so trying to explain the Oslo process and why that was such a fraud, I can understand why they'd want to censor that, because if you dig into the Oslo process, even if you just look at the number of settlements that got expanded, or the amount of settlements that grew up during the so-called peace process, you can clearly see why the credibility of Fatah and the PLO was damaged almost beyond repair, and why Hamas and others who rejected the Oslo process saw their popularity increase. The moment you explain that, and all you need to do is just show people what the Palestinians were being asked to swallow, and the fact that the Israelis kept committing pogroms and seizing lands all the way through that process. And that's why it failed. It failed because the number of concessions made by Israel were practically zero, and the concessions made by the PLO were enormous and destroyed their credibility. Yes, there was corruption as well within Fatah and within the Arafat leadership. That didn't help. But overwhelmingly, it was the fact that their credibility was destroyed by the concessions they made, and they got nothing back. In fact, they got more taken off them. The more concessions they made, the more the Zionists took, the more the American imperialists took. So once you know that Oslo was a fraud from the start, which it was, and it was only designed to create this truncated statelet that will be completely controlled by the Zionist state, and thus completely controlled by American imperialism. Once you know that, then you understand the popularity of movements like Hamas, who rejected it, and you understand the siege of Gaza, and you understand all the maneuvers that the Israelis have made since then, all for the specific purpose of making sure a viable Palestinian state was not created, and that the American imperialists have been up to their necks backing them up with that ever since then. Once you understand all of that, then you can't be won over by the fake moralistic outrage that they're pumping out 24/7 over this situation from Israeli propaganda centers, British and American propaganda centers are at this as well. So yeah, Will's point there is absolutely right. I think it's the mention of Oslo gets you censored. So I'll just disguise my future mentioning of Oslo behind perhaps other words for it. So yes, censorship alive and well, of course. The things I wanted to mention tonight, of course, as I mentioned on Telegram, there's, of course, Netanyahu thumping his chest, appearing in his traditional black outfit with no tie, which I think he's meant to make him look as if he's still in mourning, or maybe he's taking a page out of the Zelensky handbook. I'm not sure. So to only wear one outfit when apparently in a state of war. Who knows? But he appeared on TV in Israel, of course, and made a speech in which he said nothing particularly new. He promised that there would be a ground invasion, said that everybody should leave North Gaza. He did his usual fascist tub thumping, saying, "We are the light, they are the darkness." Essentially, it's an amped up version of a sort of George Bush speech from the War on Terror era. And he also said that there would be accountability, including for him, when all this was over. Of course, he doesn't mean that. He just has to throw that in there now because his popularity level in Israel is so low, and more and more questions are being raised about his personal culpability. So he has to throw that out there for domestic consumption. But of course, the bombing campaign waged by the IDF on Gaza continues, with more and more horror stories coming out of it every day. Blinken, who seems to be running the Biden administration now, though certainly because Biden isn't, said that in a meeting with what is described as Jewish leaders in the United States, I would say that if they're supporters of Israel, then the more accurate description of them would be Zionist leaders in the United States, given that we know that large numbers of Jews of all descriptions, from the secular to the ultra-Orthodox, reject Israel, and that an increasing number of them in the United States do as well. So these are Zionist leaders that Blinken was talking to, and he promised that he'd said to the Emir of Qatar that they had to tone down the coverage on Al Jazeera. Now, the irony of that is that, of course, Al Jazeera follows the line of the Qatari state largely. So when it came to Libya, when it came to Syria, the Al Jazeera was all on board with the US regime change operations. Now, of course, when it comes to Palestine, because the Qataris play a duplicitous game at all times, oftentimes they're with US imperialism, sometimes they're working slightly in the other direction. When it comes to the issue of Palestine, they do more honest reporting. And that's too much, of course, because if you see the hideous nature of the crimes that US imperialism is committing. I mean, Israel's dropping the bombs, but let's be honest, it's US imperialism which is doing this. They are the makers of the bombs. They are the suppliers of the aircraft. They supplied the money to arm and equip the Israeli armed forces. Israel does not get through another month without the backing of the US imperialists. I heard an interview with Miko Peled recently, who's a prominent critic of Israel and a supporter of the one-state solution, whose work is very much worthy of reading and whose stance you have to respect. But he made a slightly absurd assertion in his interview with Katie Halper that the BRICS countries were equally to blame for Israel's crimes. Now, I get what he was driving at, which is that, of course, Russia, China, and certainly India have been trading extensively with Israel for years. They, of course, all recognize it. Their formal position, or at least of Russia and China, is to call for a two-state solution. But they all enjoy relatively close relations with the Israeli state, even if those are running into increasingly rocky territory. But I think, if anything, the last 3 weeks have revealed to us, well, just how little sway anybody else has in Israel and just how much it is dependent upon the United States. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister and bona fide fascist, was raving the other day about how Israel was reliant on the US for air defense and all kinds of support. I mean, you name me another country in the world, of course, you can't, where for its defense the US would mobilize this amount of naval assets, of air assets, of air defense assets. They didn't do this for Ukraine. Yes, they dumped a lot of arms into Ukraine, but they didn't, of course, or couldn't move all their aircraft carrier battle groups around the place, which they've done in this case, and of course opened up what will be unlimited funding. I mean, this bill formally has, I believe it was 14 billion for Israel in it and 60 billion for Ukraine. I suspect that those numbers are going to go that is going to be subject to fierce debates, I believe, over who gets the most of that. But the crucial thing is that without the support of US imperialism, this doesn't work. Israel doesn't work. Israel doesn't survive. And I think that the way this has gone down, with the US having to provide not just military support, but commanders to advise on the ground assault. I say advise in inverted commas. In reality, they're probably going to be commanding it. So Israel is not an independent state. As I've said many times before, this is a US colonial enterprise with the rest of the US imperialist bloc tailing along behind them in support of Israel. Without the US, there is no Israel. Not for that long anyway. And of course, we hear, and again, these are rumors so far, that there is, of course, talk coming out of the US, and this has now been heard from two sources, that they're going to try and assassinate Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, if the war escalates. Now, I heard this in an interview with that old reactionary Douglas McGregor, in his interview with Tucker Carlson. He mentioned it as an aside, but the way he mentioned it made me think that this was something that had obviously been discussed, and some Pentagon insider had leaked it to McGregor on the proviso that he would repeat it on the air. And again, this has also come from Lebanese sources saying that in the event of a wider war, that Assad's residence will be immediately bombed. Well, I'm sure Assad knows that and is probably rotating where he is at various different times. He survived 10 years of war and assassination attempts. I'm sure he has plans in place for that. But the fact that the US is openly talking about assassinating Assad tells us that they are getting a bit desperate. They're clearly panic-stricken about what's going to happen if, and I do say if, Israel launches this ground assault. I strongly suspect that some kind of frantic bargaining is going on in the background. Even though there's, of course, all the shouting and the screaming and the waving of fists in public from Netanyahu, some kind of dialogue is being carried out between the United States and certainly the Palestinian resistance groups, with Hamas being the most prominent amongst them. Hamas, of course, has its political bureau in Qatar, so I'm sure that there are representations being made there by the United States, either through the State Department or at least through the CIA, to negotiate over American passport holders for a start. And now, the other detail that's emerged over the past couple of days, and this is something that McGregor asserted in his interview with Carlson that I mentioned previously, was that what was supposedly an Israeli incursion into the Gaza Strip that was driven back quickly the other day was actually an American incursion, with American special forces trying to go in and getting the crap shot out of them and retreating again. Was it perhaps those guys who were photographed with Biden the other day, where Biden inadvertently doxed them all? We don't know. But what we do know is that, of course, the American bases in northern Syria and in Iraq have been under near constant attack every day this week. And there's been multiple rocket attacks on them. There have been flights recorded going between Baghdad and the big American base in Ramstein, Germany, where they have their most extensive medical facilities. The rumor is that there's 24 plus US casualties. They're admitting to one death so far, claiming that one civilian contractor, so that's a mercenary basically, perhaps a CIA mercenary, died of a heart attack as a result of these rocket attacks. Now, if you recall the Iranian missile attacks on US bases after the assassination by Trump of General Soleimani back in I believe it was 2019. If you recall, or no, early 2020. If you recall that, the Iranians sent a series of rocket attacks into the American bases in Iraq, and no casualties were admitted to by the US, but there were suddenly a load of American forces were evacuated from Iraq just after that, with apparently like concussions, hearing loss, vision problems, dizziness, and a whole range of other things that were being used essentially as a cover story to get them out. So this so we've got a pattern here of American behavior when it comes to the Middle East. They very rarely admit to having incurred casualties, and the Biden administration is certainly going to follow along with that. If it came out that they'd sent a special forces team into Gaza, and not only had it been suffered casualties, it had also been forced to retreat, and that would be a major humiliation if that was true. I hope that somebody in the Pentagon briefing will at least ask either Kirby or whichever speak your weight machine is the official spokesman, if what McGregor said was true, and either they will deny it outright, or they'll give the answer that they give when something is true, but they don't want to say it's true, which is that we don't comment on the deployment of special forces. I hope somebody asked that. The Grey Zone certainly have an accredited reporter, I believe, in the Pentagon, so maybe he can ask that. Be certainly worth finding that out. So, um, the Israeli ground offensive keeps being threatened. Netanyahu was doing a lot of fist waving tonight. Um, so, what is going to happen? Now, Netanyahu keeps promising it and promising it and promising it, and then it keeps not happening. I'm still of the opinion that they're going to try and find a way out of this. Now, quite how they're going to find a way out of this and avoid being seen as weak and cowardly and being humiliated is another question. Norman Finkelstein had some interesting reflections on this recently, and he said that the 2006 war with Hezbollah was ended after the Israelis got messed up in the ground battle with Hezbollah and had to pull back, and they got the US to sponsor a Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Now, this was also the pattern in the 2014 incursion into Gaza, where the Israelis suffered significant casualties, including of senior officers. And again, the Obama administration stepped in and called for a ceasefire, and one was eventually acceded to at the end of August 2014. And this is probably Finkelstein thought anyway, and it is his area of expertise, how it will end this time round. Now, again, this is speculation on my part. I don't have any sources on this. I'm trying merely to intuit what a creature like Netanyahu will do, knowing as he does, and he will have been told the risks of a full-on ground invasion, and his priority being his own political and personal survival. So, what is the minimum that he needs in order to gain that? Now, he's got a massive death toll. The barbaric bombing, unrestricted bombing campaign over Gaza continues, but he hasn't gone in yet and hasn't been able to, wave a bloody shirt in the faces of the Israeli population, and the most rabid parts of it are sort of baying for blood and slaughter. So he, on a political level, needs the ground invasion. He needs the ground offensive. So what does he do? Given that the ground invasion is the red line drawn by Hezbollah, who, by the way, now have suffered between 30 to 40 deaths in combat on the northern border. So Hezbollah certainly aren't sitting this one out. As I said previously, they seem to be working their way through trying to paralyze the Israeli surveillance equipment, which is, of course, extensive on the northern border, and are suffering casualties in their firefights and exchanges of heavy gunfire with the Israeli armed forces. So Netanyahu needs to go in to do something. Quite what that something is another question. Will it be the case that the idea that they're kicking around in Washington is, how do they do a ground invasion that looks impressive enough to preserve the credibility of the Israeli state, whilst at the same time not triggering a wider war? I think that's the formula, the equation here that they're trying to get to balance. There's some who are, of course, saying, oh, well, Netanyahu wanted a wider war. He wants a war with everybody. I don't think Netanyahu is many, many things. A fascist, a crook, a psychopath, a compulsive liar, all of the above. One of the most despicable individuals on the planet. Yeah, all of that. But he's not insane. He has been prime minister when Israel was faced with significant escalation and combat losses. So he was overseeing things in 2014 when, of course, they went on that bombing rampage the last time and there was all that bloodletting. And it's, of course, on an even bigger scale now. But eventually he pulled back because he's not completely crazy. He's in government with people who are completely crazy. But the US still holds the strings here. So I think the way in which this is being conducted tells me that the US's first option was to try and ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. And for that, they needed the collaboration of the Egyptian regime. They needed al-Sisi to agree to that. He refused to agree to that out of the entirely reasonable fear, from his perspective, that the masses in Egypt would not tolerate that. And it would be very negative for him personally and politically if he did that. And the Jordanians didn't go along with it either for the same reasons. The opposition of the Jordanian masses would be too great. So that idea has sunk, and they're not going to be able to do it. The other idea is just to carry on the bombing, but that's not going to be enough to enable the Israelis to claim a victory. Netanyahu will be, and the others will be accused of being cowards and having lost to Hamas. So that idea is probably, from the perspective of Israeli politics, a non-starter. So what do they want? Now, some are saying, well, the Americans need a war, they want a war. I don't think that's strictly the case. There are some in the wilder elements in the political structures of US imperialism who do want to do just that. But bear in mind always and constantly the constraints that US imperialism operates under. You don't have to dig too far. In fact, all you need to do is to go into fairly standard journals inside the United States that look at defense and security matters to see that the American armed forces are not capable of waging a serious war against a country like Iran. They're not. They don't have the requisite troops to do it. They don't have the manpower to fight a ground war with Iran. If they try and fight just an air war with Iran, then all of their assets in the Middle East become targets. They are already. And also the Iranians could shut down the global oil trade if they wanted to. So, and they probably would if the US actually took the apocalyptic option of attacking them directly. So, whereas some elements in the US actively want to do this, I don't think that the Biden administration actually wants that. They're desperate to pretend that they are prepared to do it, but they're not capable of winning a war with Iran. I think it's something that they would end up having to admit a defeat over, which of course they don't want to do. So what do they want to do? I think that what they're trying to do now is that they are trying to persuade everybody in the region that a limited Israeli ground campaign that will go a certain way into Gaza, that will then declare that that will then enable Netanyahu to say that he's inflicted mass casualties upon Hamas. It no longer functions as an organization. We have won. And then the Americans will step in, as basing this on what Finkelstein said, and declare that the operation has been a success, but now it's time for humanitarian aid, now it's time for talks. The Americans will probably, the Biden administration will probably then try to pressure the Israelis to reopen discussions with Abbas, who's a puppet, by the way, as we've said many times before, and restart the fake negotiations over a Palestinian state, which they never intend to bring into existence, but which the Americans will need to present to the world as sort of evidence that they're being remotely even-handed. Because as this goes on, the US reputation in the world is pretty low anyway, but the longer it goes on, the lower that reputation sinks. And some of the more clever reactionaries in the Biden administration do understand that point. So to reiterate, what I think they want to do is they want to convince Hezbollah and ultimately Iran to allow a ground campaign of some kind, of a limited kind, in Gaza that will enable Netanyahu to say, I did it, I beat Hamas. And then the Americans will call for a ceasefire, they will put a resolution into the Security Council and say, look, vengeance has been had, justice has been done, time to stop, etc. And that's the agreement I think that they want to get. I think that they will be sending that signal back to Tehran and back into Beirut. Whether anybody is prepared to listen to them over that is another question, because then you have, of course, countervailing forces upon the leadership in Tehran and of course the leadership of Hezbollah, which is that the longer this goes on, the more the barbarity of the U.S. imperialists and their Zionist proxy becomes clear to the masses in the Arab countries. The more those masses mobilize and put greater pressure on even comprador leaders like the King of Jordan or al-Sisi in Egypt, then the more the pressure on them builds to not tolerate any Israeli ground incursion and to actually respond in full should even a limited one take place. So, of course, the masses get their say. And that is, of course, why Erdogan, playing his usual two-faced game, on the one hand says, "Oh well, this can't be tolerated. This is terrible. What's happening here? I denounce these Israeli actions." On the other hand, of course, he has grown trade between Turkey and Israel year on year for the last 25 years. And that's a very profitable trade for the Turkish capitalist class, and they're not going to want to give that up through some romantic act of pan-Islamic solidarity. The word solidarity and the name Erdogan do not belong together in a million years. So things are stuck at the moment because partly the Israeli regime fears what an incursion in Gaza would do, partly because the Americans are trying to figure out a way to enable them to do a limited ground incursion and then to not have that escalate into a wider war, which they can't win themselves, and trying to bargain and exert pressure on Hezbollah and Iran ultimately to ensure that this sort of arrangement can go ahead, which is, when you think about it, a tremendously cynical and brutal thing I think that they're trying to do here. But then again, these are the people who sent 500,000 off Ukrainians to their deaths without blinking an eye. So why on earth would this be beyond them? When looking at the actions of imperialism, always imagine, if you don't have solid information, that their actions are always going to be the most cynical, the most cowardly, and the most brutal possible, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what they're going to do. Right, I'll pause now for questions in the amongst the audience. So, Paul says, "Good morning, Antipodean comrades. Good evening to Alex and the Euro-communists. No offence intended, but offence very much taken. And good day to everyone. Any other comrade who feels left out, great to be listening to this. Well, great to have you here. Good evening to Brian Gillespie in Dublin. Good evening to Morgan, who's catching up. DE says, lots of war on terror catchphrases and propaganda narratives getting rehashed and reused. Very true. Good evening to Burke. Philbin says, most of Arab and traditional allied states betrayal of most Arab and allied states has to have been a factor in deciding the Gaza counterattack by the Palestinians, while questions on real union remains internal. Oslo 67 line talk is over. Interesting. Yu Wan says, Arafat was a fraud from his early days in Kuwait in the early 60s, in bed with Palestinian capital, most concerned about his personal glory. Very true. Jimmy Carter 2.0 is the label every American president is trying to avoid. Yes. KP Jen says, thank you, MELEI, for the info. Thumbs up and share. Yes, be sure to like and share the stream and annoy whoever keeps reporting us to YouTube. Zweibacher says, greetings. What are your thoughts on the Trotskyite International Group? Figured you could maybe say some things about them since you were a Trotskyist yourself. Are you referring to, the Trotskyist Fourth International? There's several Trotskyist internationals. There's the United Secretariat of the Fourth International, there's the Committee for a Workers' International, and about half a dozen others who all split away from the Fourth International. So, if you could clarify, Zweibacher, what you're referring to, which one you're referring to, because there's several bearing the title. Mohammed Mohsen says, Honestly, their reputation on the ground wars is not that good. I think you're referring to the IDF there. Um, any chance of getting Scott Ritter back on the show? Well, I have asked and he hasn't responded. So we could try again, but I'm not inclined to. I'm not inclined to ask somebody more than once. If he doesn't want to do it, he can find plenty of other platforms to go on. Solidarity from Spain says unused sub, and Solidarity right back to you. Bernardo Bender says good morning, and good morning back to you. Binod Faru says IMT. Oh, do you mean International Marxist Tendency? Because if it's them that you mean, I do have some knowledge of them being being an ex-Trotskyite myself. Yeah, I mean, the IMT, if you're not fully aware of who they are a group that split away from the old militant tendency in 1991, I believe it was, over differences about, well, whether they were going to be inside the Labour Party or outside of it. IMT is still inside the Labour Party. Its website isn't as bad as many others. They at least take the time to do analysis on it. But essentially, they are a joke organisation. They're a joke organisation because their line of their parent or party, well, not even a party, but the newspaper they're organised around, is that they have to be organised inside the Labour Party. And they're still in the Labour Party to this day. They've been in it for 30 years. Well, actually longer, 50 years, if you count the fact that they originally came out of the militant tendency. And they've now rebranded themselves and are saying that they're the communists, and they're using a lot of Soviet imagery. But the the way in which they use that is, of course, dishonest, because they're, when you look at them, orthodox Trotskyites who think that the Soviet Union post 1927 was almost a uniformly bad thing. So again, it's because as time goes on and more historical research is done, and the devastating effect of the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just on the USSR and the inheritor nations of the old USSR, but on the entire world, the damage done by the 30-year unrestricted rampage of US imperialism. As that becomes more and more obvious, favorability towards the USSR goes up, and also favorability towards Stalin goes up as the works of people like Grover Furr become more widely available and people read up on that. The popularity of Trotskyism takes a fucking nosedive, so they have to hide behind Soviet aesthetics. And yeah, I used to read their stuff quite a lot. I don't anymore because, you know, once you read up on how Trotskyism actually works, you strongly distrust anything that comes out of a Trotskyite organization. And I would strongly distrust anything that came out of the IMT, because you don't survive 30 years in the Labour Party, from the years of Neil Kinnock through to the years of Keir Starmer, without either being fatally compromised by the state or being so utterly useless and irrelevant that even the worst Labour Party witch hunters don't bother to throw you out. So useless or compromised by the state, or perhaps both. Either way, forget about them. Not worth bothering with. Right, okay. US, not IDF. Yes, okay, got that. Escobar or Sloboda? Well, maybe. I've asked Sloboda before and he's ignored me. So what are you going to do? Militant tendency. I think I explained that one. President Jesus, I think you might be right. Banana Bender says, I didn't realise, but in the UK there is another party called the Cooperative Party. Cooperative Party is it's part of the Labour Party. The way the Labour Party was organised when it was founded, it was originally called the Labour Representation Committee. And then it became the Labour Party. It was originally still a federation. It had a federation structure under which various other organisations used to sit. And so when you see Labour MPs on TV these days, if you can stand to look at them for more than 5 seconds, you'll see next to them Labour or Labour and Co-op. And the Cooperative Party is one of the original founding organisations of the Labour Party that still exists within the federation structure. It's a bit of a joke, to be honest. I mean, I was a member of it for about 5 minutes, about 6 or 7 years ago. There was a brief plot by some of us to try and take it over. I didn't go very far. But it's an organisation which is dominated by like right-wing, very reactionary trade union officials and the very reactionary elements of the Labour Party. It basically focuses on community development projects. It's essentially an NGO now. That's all it is. And so back when the Labour Party was launched, it was a federation which your organisation could apply for affiliation to, but remain still an independent organisation, which is what the Cooperative Party supposedly is. That, by the way, is when Lenin, in the book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, recommended the early Communist Party of Great Britain, the very young Communist Party of Great Britain, to seek affiliation to the Labour Party. That's what he's referring to in that book. Because back then, you could affiliate to the Labour Party, become formally aligned within it, but keep your own organisation intact, because that's what the Cooperative Party has. That's the relationship they had, as did the Independent Labour Party for a while. So that's what Lenin was essentially asking or telling the early Communist Party to do. Seek affiliation. Don't wind up your organisation, but seek affiliation on the same basis that these other groups had it, and therefore seek to influence workers within that organisation, within the Labour Party, with the ultimate idea that, yes, either the Labour Party will get elected and there'll be a strong communist influence behind it, or you'll get ejected, but you'll take a big group of workers with you and be able to form a larger communist party when you're expelled as a result. Of course, the people who run the Labour Party weren't stupid enough to fall for that. They were never going to allow the Communist Party in, no matter how many times they applied, and eventually the CPGB rightly stopped asking. Then, of course, 20-odd years later, the CPGB made the disastrous error of assuming that only by working with the Labour Party could a socialist advance be made, and therefore they condemned communism in Britain to a reformist dead end for the next 70 years. But yes, that's what the Cooperative Party is. It's an affiliate to the Labour Party. All right. Bino Taru says, can you talk about the betrayal of Arafat, referring to Yuan's comment above? And hello to Dan Kovalik, who we've interviewed on the program before. Good to have you on. The betrayal of Arafat. Now, I'm basing this on my knowledge of mainly the Oslo process. So I haven't fully and properly researched the actions of the PLO prior to 93. I'm only just beginning that process of doing the research. So all I can comment on is what I've already said, essentially. So why don't I take Bynod's comment and come back to it when I've done the research? Because I can tell you about all the concessions that Arafat made through the 90s, for which he got nothing. Now, of course, the US wanted to use Arafat's authority that he undoubtedly did enjoy within the Palestinian masses to essentially get him to play the role that Mahmoud Abbas is playing now, running a statelet completely controlled by US imperialism. That's what they wanted him to do. And in the end, Arafat said no, because if he was under an enormous amount of pressure from the Palestinian masses themselves, the Second Intifada had broken out, and he couldn't agree to that. Even if he'd have wanted to, it would have meant the end of his influence within the Palestinian masses and the Palestinian movements. But what I will do is I will come back to the PLO in a future episode when I've done the proper research on it. If Bynod could let me know in the comments if that's an acceptable answer to the point there, deferring it to when I've fully read the appropriate materials on that point, because I don't want to be just repeating cliches on that one. So moving on past this, so that takes us through the first part of the program. I did say there will be three things on the agenda tonight. I want to briefly mention what's going on in Avdiivka, which of course is the site, or one of the sites, where the Ukrainian armed forces, or let's perhaps give them the more appropriate title, the NATO auxiliary forces, are bombing via artillery shelling of Donetsk city. That's one of the places that the shelling's been done over the past several years. The Russian armed forces are approaching that and are surrounding it and have cut off most access to it. And now the Ukrainians have apparently been throwing reinforcements into this, knowing that, of course, this is a key strategic position for them. If they lose it, then they lose what little advantage they've got left in Donetsk, and maybe get pushed back even further. So it'll be a major blow also to Zelensky politically, given that he's, according to internal sources inside Ukraine. So there's two principal Ukrainian telegram channels that seem to be receiving information from inside the office of the president of Ukraine. And those are Legitimny and Resident. And I think Legitimny said the other day that that Zelensky was getting desperate for a variety of reasons. The Russian pressure on the front lines was growing. That there was increasing problems with the mobilization process inside Ukraine. All of you watching this, I'm sure, will have seen the enormous problems that seem to be being created by mobilization. You'll have all seen the videos with the conscription officers basically acting like an old-fashioned British Royal Navy press gang, roving around Ukrainian cities, getting guys in a headlock and throwing them into the back of a van. We've seen interviews with Ukrainians who have surrendered to the Russian armed forces and talking about how they were given barely 2 weeks training, given a gun and tossed into the field and then abandoned. I mean, you can say, and I'm sure some do, that, well, a lot of these Ukrainians are just saying what the Russian captors want to hear. And there would be some validity to that if this wasn't backed up from multiple sources. So the whole question of how the Ukrainians are treated and how they're trained, well, we know from leaks that have come out of NATO training camps inside Britain and the United States and France and Germany that at best they're only getting around about 6 weeks training before they get tossed back into the field. And those are the ones who are apparently the chosen units, who are regarded as special or have some special duties in mind. The units that are just pure cannon fodder are not trained outside of Ukraine. They're apparently kept inside of Ukraine. So they're given like 2 to 3 weeks at most training on how to use a gun, and then just tossed out to act as essentially bullet stoppers. The question of like, well, what happens now is, of course, something I'll come back to in just a moment. But there are increasing numbers of surrenders of Ukrainian forces to Russian forces. I saw the other day, it was on the Slavyangrad channel, and this has been confirmed by stuff that's come out of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation as well. There's an increasingly large 10 to 15,000, according to Russian sources. So again, take that as you will. Could be propaganda, but I think there is certainly a degree of reality to this. That there's 10 to 15,000 Ukrainians who surrendered, Ukrainian armed forces who surrendered, who are now fighting for the Russian Federation under a newly organized regiment. And I can see that being true. Certainly an awful lot of the original forces of in the Donbass were people who were either serving or recently served Ukrainian armed forces who had defected to the Donbass rebellion in order to resist the fascist comprador regime that was being built in Kiev. So now there's more and more of these men turning up who are surrendering and then seeking to go into the service of the Russian Federation to, as they put it in an interview I saw on the Slavyangrad channel, liberate their country. So Avdiivka falling will further exacerbate all the massive problems that even Ukrainian sources are saying now exist inside the Ukrainian armed forces, that the pressures on the Zelensky regime continue to grow, its internal contradictions continue to grow, and now you've got the competition for resources with the Middle East and Israel. Interestingly enough, I've seen others comment on this too, but I think my assertion that there was a belief flying around in the early part of this war in the Middle East, this war waged by the Israelis on Gaza, on the Palestinians, that this would detract from what the US was trying to do in Ukraine. I'm certain now, after Biden's speech and after the numbers that the Biden administration put into this bill that's going before Congress, I am certain that they are determined not to give up on the Ukrainian project, regardless of what goes on in the Middle East. I think the assets they're transferring to the Middle East, I mean, as I said before, I think they're trying to fudge some kind of deal there to enable the Israelis to get out of this with them getting their state intact. But I still think that the prize for US and British imperialism in Ukraine, not in Ukraine, the prize is the Russian Federation itself. That's always been the prize. Ukraine was merely the tool chosen to do it. They wanted to add to the tools they had at their disposal by, of course, overthrowing Lukashenko and getting their, Juanita Guaidovskaya, Tikhanovskaya, I should say, into office, the Belarusian Juan Guaido. But thankfully, that bid to depose Lukashenko failed, and his rule has only strengthened since then, I think. But the Ukraine was only ever a tool to be used against the Russian Federation to destabilize it in various different ways, to enable what was ultimately done, which is the full imposition of a massive sanctions regime, with the hope that combining that and what they hoped would be military defeat and humiliation in Ukraine, that would combine and lead to the overthrow of the Putin system. And we've gone into before exactly what that is. I will repeat that I think that the Putin system is a form of generally progressive Bonapartism. And we can return to the subject of Bonapartism in the future if there's an enthusiasm to do that. But this has, of course, not gone well so far for them. The Russian government proved to be wise to the game, insulated itself as far as possible, and so far has survived the sanctions war waged on it. But do not be surprised that the US imperialists are not giving this up. The prize, i.e. the conquest of state power within the Russian Federation, the ability to return to the period of unrestricted plundering of Russian resources and the removal of Russia as a potential competitor, or perhaps the more accurate word to use would be barrier, the Russian barrier to unrestricted looting of places like Burkina Faso, like Niger, like Mali, where these new governments headed by military juntas, but generally of the progressive nationalist type, are taking direct inspiration from the actions of the Russian Federation and receiving assistance from them as well. It might be called Wagner, but in reality, as the visit of Deputy Defense Minister Yevkurov shows, his tour around West Africa, it's very much the Russian Federation which is providing that security assistance. And, of course, Rosatom has just agreed to build a nuclear power station in Burkina Faso. So that has all been one in the eye for French imperialism. Perhaps that's why Macron is touring around the Middle East making bizarre statements about getting an international coalition together to fight Hamas. Well, after you, Emmanuel, send your guys in first. I'm sure they'll do about as well as the Americans or Israelis will do. So, the prize remains for US imperialism. Their wish to get themselves in a position where they can destroy the Putin government, that's something that they are very much still pursuing, and they are going to continue to pursue. That's why I don't think that they actually want this big war in the Middle East. I think that they want to continue their strategy of trying, however they can, to spin out this war in Ukraine in the hope that something will work, that something in the Russian economy will snap, that something will turn their way on the battlefield. That's why I think, that's part of the reason why I think that they don't want this big war in the Middle East. I think they want to actually return to having full focus on Ukraine, because they know, for all the honking and bellowing about Israel, they know quite well that Israel is a difficult sell for them. It's a much more difficult sell for them than supposedly defending Ukraine, even though that's not what they're doing. And of course the prize involved, i.e. the conquest of the Russian Federation, its removal as a barrier to them, that's far bigger than any prize that is available right now in the Middle East. Yes, they would love to get rid of the regime in Tehran. They'd love to do that. They don't have the capability to do it right now. And with the all the deals that were signed in Beijing recently as part of the Belt and Road Forum, they really want to try and disrupt that Russia-China partnership. They don't know how. They're just going to keep plugging away in Ukraine and keep throwing Ukrainian lives into the maws of the Russian guns. So let's pause now for more comments from the audience here. Irish Partisan says, I see Russian paratroopers raise the USSR flag over the slag heap in Avdiivka. Yeah, that's got to have annoyed the anti-communist currents inside the Russian government. But as now we're getting more and more statues of Comrade Stalin unveiled across the Russian Federation, it certainly seems that the anti-communists inside the Russian government are on the back foot. Right, Zweibacher says, about the trot question, they were characterized as ortho-trots by Morpin, if that helps. They're called the Internationalist Group, I think. Seems to be headquartered in NYC. Yeah, the ortho-trot thing, I think that refers to like the people like the Spartacists, like the international Bolshevik tendency. They're accused, or they have been accused in the past, of being crypto-Stalinists. Essentially, what they're close to is the position that they say was Trotsky's at the end of his life, which is where, at the very end, just before his assassination, which, by the way, was carried out by a member of his own group, who was disgruntled with him, at the very end, he did call for unconditional defense of the USSR in the coming war. Previously, he'd called for the USSR to be broken up. So take this with however many buckets of salt you want. But the orthodox trots, as they are described, they will still defend the progressive elements, as they call it, in the Soviet system, and will continue to defend it. For a while, even someone like Ernest Mandel did that until towards the end of his career and his life. Now, the reason why they're described as orthodox trots is that there is the other variety of Trotskyite, which is descended. This is principally an American and a British school, because that's where most Trotskyites come from. That and France and maybe Germany. This comes from, of course, the Max Shachtman, who was I think the founder of this. And he, of course, founded the tendencies that were to become, neoconservatism, as it is called in the United States. He was originally, I believe, that Michael Harrington, the founder of the DSA, belonged to like a Shachtmanite tendency. Now, Shachtman decried the Soviet Union and denounced it and said it was just as bad as imperialism. By the way, plenty of so-called Western Maoists went on to do the same thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and up to this day, and said that in actual fact it was in some ways worse than imperialism, which is why Shachtman ended up in a very long and undistinguished career shilling for imperialism in the end. And his political descendants continue to do that to this day. So the orthodox Trotskyites, like the International Bolshevik Tendency and others, they reject the Shachtman line and claim that they're not real Trotskyites, and that the real Trotskyites defend the progressive elements in the Soviet Union, and that they defend the achievements of the planned economy. That's what they'll say. So that puts them in a different category to like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty or the Alliance of White Liberals, the pro-NATO Trots. It puts them in a slightly different position than like the SWP in Britain, and I think it's the same in Ireland, where they claimed, following the theories of Tony Cliff in his book on state capitalism in the Soviet Union, that capitalism had already been restored in Russia by the 1930s. And of course, various tendencies claimed that capitalism had been restored in the Soviet Union all the way through the 60s and the 70s. The Maoists claimed it, the Hojerists claimed it. I maintain that capitalism was not actually fully and properly restored in the Soviet Union until right up to the end, in the end of 1991, beginning of 1992. That's the point where capitalism was actually restored. So I can go into that in more detail if people are interested. But I want to go on and mention something else now before closing, and perhaps I need to return to this in more detail tomorrow. But I wanted to mention the fact that the Sarah Wagenknecht and 9 other German MPs have taken a leap of faith and formed their own organisation. It has released it's in English. The translation is Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. Now, I believe if any Germans are on the stream tonight, they can correct me if I'm wrong. That the Wagenknecht is one of the most well-known political leaders in Germany who isn't or hasn't been in the government. And so her founding of this organization is a significant act. And of course, she has a reputation amongst the left in Germany and wider Europe as being some sort of crypto right-winger. Having read the founding statement, though, it reads like an old-school social democrat manifesto, to be honest. It doesn't read like she's accused of being a Stalinist. Certainly doesn't read like the works of any Marxist-Leninist organization that I'm aware of. It reads like actually it reads like what the original purpose of I think it was called the WASG, which was Oscar Lafontaine's breakaway from the SPD. It reads like something that he would have come out with. There is perhaps a residual influence of the kind of politics that the SPD in the era of Brandt would embrace. But certainly it's nothing particularly out there radical. It's going to be made to look that way by the hysterical response that both the German left and the German bourgeois are going to come out with about it. Now, I'll go into more detail about it tomorrow. I wanted to just register it for now because I think it bears discussion for longer than we've got tonight because of two things. The idea of, is there any capacity in Europe right now to launch this kind of social democratic platform? Does it have any value in doing so? And is there any value in communists participating in it in some way? Now, we mentioned previously on this stream tonight the opinion of Lenin towards affiliation to the Labour Party back in the 1920s. So is it worth German Marxist-Leninists affiliating to this Sarah Wagenknecht organization? Discussion I think we could spend an hour on. What about the program of this organization? Could it be something that would ever be implemented? My opinion is not with regard to the current situation inside Germany. So we'll return to this tomorrow. I'm out of time for tonight. So we'll lead tomorrow, unless there's a dramatic development in Palestine or in with regard to Ukraine. We'll lead with the Wagenknecht question tomorrow. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. I see we've got around about 50 on the stream. So I will call it a day for now and pick up on the questions tomorrow. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow evening.